f-stop, your aperture size is going to change. It's going to get smaller.
But that happens automatically in the camera itself.
In the camera, yeah. It's part of the, But it will change the amount that you see.
Sorry, let me just get something in there, Zach. Sorry to interrupt you, just because it's so critical. So, yes, that happens in the camera. So, the diffraction limit is the camera end. I just want to make that clear. So, when we're talking about refraction or atmospheric effects or dirty air or whatever the bloody hell you want to call it, that's out there. You know, it's what's happening in the thing that you're looking at. Whereas the diffraction limit is at the camera end or your eye end, and as Zach's pointed out, it's based on the aperture, or that's where your mathematics at least would start to calculate when things are going to start to disappear based on their distance, is due to the aperture. So yes, you increase the f-stop on your camera, that's going to change the diffraction limit because you're increasing the aperture.
How would you calculate that, Nathan?
Hey, can I just real quick? I would totally. That's absolutely correct. In my opinion, again, refraction is occurring prior to the light hitting the camera. Once the light hits the aperture, it's going to diffract. And I would just say, Zach, my opinion of zoom, I've kind of looked at this back and forth. I don't think zoom changes the diffraction limit of the observer. I think the thing that changes the diffraction limit would be changing observer types. So going from binoculars to a telescope, or going from a zoom camera to an iPhone, P900 to an iPhone, because the greatest aperture is going to be the greatest or the best resolution, right? And when you're zooming, you're reducing it. So in my opinion, all you're doing with zoom is just blowing a picture up within your view, but it doesn't necessarily change the diffraction limit. It doesn't change what you can see as a visible horizon. But if I
the f-stop though.
Here,
well, yes, you're right, and yes, with the f-stop, it is changing the aperture, but it's tightly calibrated, isn't it? So I think I'd probably, if it came to a row about it, Zach, I'd probably have to side with Life is Short on account of the fact that you'd have to calibrate the optics. So presumably, if you just increase the aperture size at massive zoom, it would just completely fuck the picture up, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it wouldn't be.
Well,
I
think that
anymore.
If you change the aperture, what you do is you change the depth of focus, don't you?
Well, one thing to take into consideration that
Was that a hard question? I mean,
It was a statement,
if you change
wasn't
the
it?
aperture size, don't you change the depth of focus? So, for example, if you have a large aperture like a 4, you would focus on your subject and just a little before and after. But if you have an f/16, you could focus on a much larger area. Isn't that kind of the way that works?
Sure.
No, the f-stop works backwards. The larger the f-stop,
Is
the smaller the aperture.
Correct.
Yeah.
So when you have a smaller aperture, you have
that's what happens when you're zooming in.
No, if you have a smaller aperture, you have a deeper depth of focus, whereas a larger aperture, like, comparing an f/16 to, say, an f/2.8, you have a very tight focus that's right around your subject, whereas on an f/16, you would see a lot of things between you and the subject and after the subject in focus.
Yeah, you're equivocating though. What we're saying is, rather than changing the depth of field within the camera, if you increase the optics and their calibration entirely to go to something that's calibrated to have a larger aperture, like a telescope, in other words, you're going to get a greater resolution and a decrease in the diffraction limit. In other words, you will see further because of the bigger aperture, as opposed to changing it on the fly with zoom, which will be calibrated to that specific device, which was Life is Short's point. So as you go from an iPhone up to a P900 and from a P900 to a telescope, that's where the aperture difference makes the difference, as opposed to getting the focal length right.
Well, I'm not a professional photographer, but I've taken a few pictures in my life, and I think the aperture not only controls the focus, but controls the amount of light that is exposed to the film or the plate, right?
yes.
So if you have a zoom, you're bringing in a lot less light, so your aperture must be larger, right? In order to get enough light to take the photograph. Isn't that the way that kind of works?
No, your zoom gets, as you zoom in, your aperture will get smaller. It'll go up on your f-stop, but what you do to find your aperture, you
So
take
the
the size of
camera
your
get
lens.
larger or smaller.
You
Yeah.
take the size of your lens and you divide it by the f-stop, and that'll give you the size
Yeah.
of the aperture. So if your f-stop is getting larger, your aperture size is getting smaller.
So Zach, that's my problem with the zoom though, because what happens to D, the denominator in Rayleigh criteria, when you do that?
Yeah, it actually gets larger. So you're going to see less as you zoom in along that horizon. The amount
Well,
that's diffracted.
the aperture gets
Interesting.
smaller, right? So D gets smaller.
No, well, yeah.
Okay, so what happens to the angle? The angle gets larger.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. The more you
Right.
zoom in, the actual more that will be diffracted along that line, along the horizon. That line will get actually bigger.
Okay, I mean, I can agree with that. If you're saying the resolution angle increases as you zoom in, I can agree with that.
Yeah, but what
I'd
you're
agree with
doing
that
is
as well.
you're describing zooming. That's what you're doing there, right?
Yeah.
Right, but that's different to physically increasing the apparatus aperture.
Right.
Well, as he mentioned, the f-stop divided by the aperture is your formula, right? Is
No,
that
the
correct?
lens,
Or
the
no,
size
the
of the
focal
lens.
length. Yeah, the focal length divided by the aperture is the same amount of light on a larger lens. Wouldn't you you'd have to change the aperture size, right?
Well, yeah, like I said, if you have a
How would
larger
you
lens and you
how
have
would you
two that are
change the
both
aperture?
like,
How
You
would
can
the
set the
aperture
you can
change?
change the aperture manually, but there's also a limit to the aperture size in a telephoto lens or whatever lens is incorporated within a specific camera.
yeah, it has
Now,
to be within a certain range, or else it'll just be blurry. You won't have any clarity to it at all.
I agree, and you also need enough light to do it. So if I had a 50 millimeter lens and I had a certain f-stop, say an f4, and I increased that lens to a 500 millimeter lens, what would happen to the f-stop? What would happen to the aperture size?
it's also dependent on the ISO setting that you set for within a camera. So
Same
there
for
could
both.
be low light, but if you
No,
have
we'll
a
use the
camera
same
that
for
can
both.
take pictures, and why are you interrupting me? I'm just trying to get people to understand a little bit more about cameras. So if you have a camera that can actually take a lot better pictures without so much grainy images being taken at low light settings, if you have a camera that can take pictures at a higher ISO, you don't need to have as much light. So you can take a lot of different pictures if you have a good camera. It doesn't have to be very, very bright. And sometimes very, very bright isn't that great because you won't be able to take as good of a contrast of pictures when you take pictures in bright light. So there's a lot of things. Go ahead. You can go ahead.
Let me rephrase my question then again. With everything else being held equal, if I have a f-stop of 4 and a 50 millimeter lens, and I change out that lens and make it a 500 millimeter lens, what would my f-stop be in order to have the same amount of light hitting the film?
I'll take it from the pause that nobody has an answer. So
Yeah, I have no idea. My
Okay.
camera has all that stuff built into it. I don't mess with lenses and stuff like that. It's all,
So-
I just have a piece
All
of
right.
thing.
I was just curious.
So it's a little bit of weird calculation because f-stop based off of some, I think it's radius or something. So for example, an f1 lets in twice as much light as like a f1.4. So and then an
Okay.
f2 lets in twice. No, an f1.4 lets in twice as much as an f2. So there's a little bit of calculation there. That's why I can't give you
Okay, so I started with an
definite
f4 at 50. How would I set up the calculation to get my f-stop for a 500 millimeter lens?
You're gonna have to look that up. I don't know off the top of my head.
sorry,
Again,
right,
it's
fair
it's
enough.
not
Okay.
simple like
sorry,
is the
Bob.
claim
What's the
here?
point in the line of questioning, though? Where are you going with this?
All right. I was just curious.
Oh, fair enough. So you asked
Yeah.
at the beginning. You asked
And,
me
you know,
about
there's a lot of
you
things
asked me
that
at the
I don't
beginning.
know. There's nothing wrong with
okay,
not
your
knowing the
curiosity is
answer. I was just
fascinating.
curious if
Your
anybody did.
curiosity is really interesting. You asked me at the beginning. You asked me a question. You said, "What's the mathematics for the diffraction limit?"
Yeah, I am kind of curious. I'm thinking about turning over a new leaf, Nathan. I'm thinking about, instead of doing things on the globe, I'd like to prove the flat Earth. So I'm wondering, do you guys have a formula or something that I could use to calculate how much would be obstructed by the horizon in the refraction zone?
It's called a calendar. It's called April Fool's Day.
Hold on.
I like that.
No.
Hold on.
Actually,
Zach.
I'm not.
Hold on.
I'm not
Hold
crapping
on.
with you right
You've
now.
asked a question.
No, I'm not crapping with you right now. I'm
Sure.
not going to
Yeah,
show up.
actually,
don't
I
know
have
you
a
guys well
calculation
enough
that
to
can
put
give you the limit.
Bob, guys,
All right.
go ahead, Zach.
Yeah.
It's on my channel. You can find it in Perspective and How Our Eyes Work, the playlist I have. I
What's
can't
your
remember the exact name of
what's
the
your
video.
YouTube channel?
GUDTIMS, the number 4, ALL. And I
No,
pretty much just took,
What's your YouTube channel? I'll look it up.
yeah, GUDTIMS, the number 4, ALL.
That's your YouTube channel? That's
Yeah.
your username on YouTube?
Good times for
Yeah,
all.
good times for all.
So, Zach, you know the mathematical formula off the top of your head. You've recited it once before. Because we're still in the after show and it's going to be dedicated to the recording, can you just rattle that off now?
Yeah, no problem. It's called Rayleigh's criterion. It is radians equals 1.22 times lambda over diameter. Lambda is just your wavelength of light.
Yep. Yeah, I'm familiar with the Rayleigh's criteria.
So that
Yeah,
common,
all I did was I took that and I applied distance to it, pretty much.
You say you're familiar with the Rayleigh
Right.
criterion, so you appreciate that things disappear with distance then?
Yeah, the Rayleigh criteria
once
has
you
to
have
do
the-
mostly with
Hold on,
two-point
Bob, let's let Bob answer.
discernment.
Sorry, Bob. You appreciate that the Rayleigh criterion would calculate the diffraction limit, the point that things disappear into the distance, or a hair disappears because you're too far for the resolution of the hair.
Yeah, Rayleigh's criteria has to do primarily with being able to tell two things apart.
Yeah, the point where it's interfering, i.e., diffracting.
Yeah.
Right. So you appreciate that is a calculation for how things can disappear into the distance, correct?
Okay, so I can
I'm
apply
just
the
waiting for a
Rayleigh
yes
criteria.
or a no. Is that an okay yes or an okay no? Do you appreciate that is a calculation for how things can disappear into the distance? Do you
Yes.
appreciate? You do appreciate that.
Yeah.
Can
Yeah,
you show
of course
me?
I do.
Can you show me in any curve calculator where that formulation is taken into consideration, please?
Well, I'm not really interested in curve calculators
I am.
right now. What
This is
I'm
a
trying
flat
to do
Earth
is
debate.
I'm trying to figure
This
out.
is a flat Earth debate.
I'm trying to figure out how
It's a flat
I can
Earth debate.
predict
You've asked us enough
how much
questions
of
about
something will be
f-stops. Now I'm
distant.
asking you something, Bob. I would like
Sure, go
you,
ahead.
given that you understand the Rayleigh criterion and its significance in respect to things disappearing with distance, to show me in any calculation for your model of a globe that you believe you live on where that is taken into consideration, please.
It's not,
Why not?
because it's basically based on triangles.
Sorry.
It-
It's based on triangles. We have a formula that you are aware of that takes into effect things disappearing with distance and a calculation for things disappearing with distance doesn't take it into account.
You know, I think you raise a really good point, Nathan.
You're damn straight. It's a curve calculator that talks about things disappearing into the distance, and according to Bob the fallacy guy, it doesn't take into account the very calculation called the Rayleigh criterion that absolutely accounts for things disappearing with distance. That's very interesting, Bob. I'd agree.
Nathan, why are you calling me names? I came on here very nice. Pam?
Because you came on before and used fallacies repeatedly. You talked about R and used it to reify the horizon into the leading edge of a sphere. That's a fallacy called reification. So you are
Did I
called
do that today,
Bob.
Nathan?
I'm talking. You asked a question. Do you not like the answers? When you repeatedly use fallacy instead of science, you will be appropriately named Bob the fallacy guy, as opposed to Bob the science guy. If you provided science, we wouldn't need to call you Bob the fallacy guy. So, Bob the fallacy guy, you have confirmed for my audience that the calculation for your reified sphere world that we absolutely do not live on does not account for the calculation for things disappearing into the distance, which would be the Rayleigh criterion. Why? Why not? Has he run away?
Yeah, he left.
Oh my God. So he's realised that by conceding that he understands the Rayleigh criterion and that it absolutely deals with things disappearing into the distance, and conceding that it does not get accounted for in the global mathematics, he's performed one of the biggest blunders of the globe side probably in the last 2 or 3 months. I hope he realises that was recorded.
Where's my 5K, Rory?
Yeah,
That's what I've been trying to tell that guy
damn,
for
you
a
stole
week
my
now.
thunder. I was just about to get there for you, Zach. Right, absolutely correct, Rory. Just in case you're listening, you'll get a nice little trimmed out version of this on Zachary Zabala, GUDTIMS number 4. All will be trimming out this little section of this video and presenting it for the $5,000 you owe him. Zachary Zabala's owed $5,000 by a guy called Rory who asked about perspective, claiming that it was included. Well, we've just had a declaration from someone on his own side, Bob the Science Guy, that makes it very clear it isn't. So, somebody owes Zachary Zabala $5,000. His name's Rory.
Yeah, I saw him still making